The artificial U.S. housing crisis is a story of powerful special interest groups, big government, weaponized subsidies, and anti-competitive regulations. These forces, while claiming to serve pro-social aims, in practice, merely seek to construct wealth funnels enshrined in federal law that make its stakeholders wealthy while keeping you poor. Perhaps, above all, it's a lesson in not taking the stated intent of government action literally. They may claim to help you, but if you check under the hood, it is the very opposite. This perverse inversion leads us to a paradox. The government is both incompetent and hypercompetent. Incompetent in that it rarely achieves the goals that it claims to pursue, but hypercompetent in enriching its true stakeholders, de facto corporate monopolies, trade associations, and portions of the voting population that are lucky enough to benefit from the antisocial fusion of big government and big corporation. At the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we have the most fundamental: food, clothing, and shelter. In this video, we'll discuss a 50-year-old law that keeps you poor, exploiting the fundamental need for shelter, a home. The U.S. housing crisis is almost entirely artificial. Here, we will show that this artificial crisis is almost entirely downstream from a 1974 law that successfully targeted and sidelined the highly competitive, innovative, and economic disparity shattering industry of factory-produced, manufactured homes. Although corporations and trade unions have their own profit motives, which is perfectly fine within a competitive system of prosperity-producing free enterprise, big government, along with its weapons of regulation and subsidies, allows for the construction of inescapable structural barriers and wealth funnels that, in practice, destroy industrial competitiveness and your wallet, your wealth, and your future along with it. This system is structural in the true sense of the word and is composed of two main features: barriers and channels. Barriers serve to block competition. Burdensome regulations force innovators out of the market, while channels seek to route vast flows of federal money, subsidies, and consumer demand to the right places, or the wrong places, depending on your perspective. Through lobbying, manipulation of public perception, and the hijacking of the government apparatus itself, once constructed, these structural systems are highly robust, resilient, and guaranteed to funnel wealth for decades. Over 100 years ago, the revolution of mass production and the assembly line ushered in a great age of prosperity. Along with the jobs that it provided, it also provided affordable products that could be purchased by the very workers who made them. This innovative breakthrough would see quality of life amongst the formerly destitute and working poor skyrocket. Prior to mass production, most products were handmade, expensive, and only attainable by the wealthy classes. After mass production, even a working class person could afford to buy and benefit from products like cars, watches, home appliances, as well as cheaper food and clothing. However, if you look around modern America today, you will see that there is one industry that has largely escaped the efficiencies and economies of scale that come with mass production: home construction. Rather than manufacturing small affordable homes within highly specialized, safe, and efficient factories, we instead build them on the side of the road. These working men must wake up early in the morning to drive and commute long distances, sometimes hours away, to remote job sites. There, they will be found carrying heavy loads up rickety ladders, balancing on roofs, and breaking their backs under sun, rain, wind, or snow to build homes in the most inefficient way possible. Or, you could say, the most expensive and dangerous way possible. But this was not always the case. Prior to the 1974 law, courtesy of the U.S. government's Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, things were much different. Passed in 1974 and coming into effect in 1976, the National Manufactured Housing Construction and Safety Standards Act, often simply known as the HUD Code, was purportedly done to help keep the public safe. Despite there having been valid safety-related concerns with manufactured homes, especially those around fire resistance, this law would, in effect, serve to protect the traditional construction monopolies and usher in the end of small, affordable homes in America. Through the powers of efficiency achievable by factory production, manufactured homes are manufactured at a cost per square foot that is 1/3 to 1/2 less than traditional stick-built homes. Stick-built or stick builders being an industry term that refers to traditional on-site construction methods. Further, and most importantly for solving the housing crisis, factory production methods are most efficient at building small homes. Small homes are the least profitable for traditional builders, and as such, we have seen small home construction almost completely disappear in America. If we look to the data, we can see that factory-produced home construction skyrocketed in the early 1960s and early 1970s. Then, after the HUD Code went into effect in 1976, This boom of small affordable home production ended. The timing of this law was also catastrophic. The housing market collapsed in 1974 following a recession induced by the energy crisis. Once the economy turned around, the 1976 introduction of the HUD Code effectively wiped out the manufactured home industry while solidifying the dominance of the traditional construction monopolies. A quick note, here we will refer to these entities as a monopoly or a de facto monopoly. Although there is competition between individual stick builders, we will use the term monopoly with respect to the construction method, the traditional stick-built industry versus the factory-produced industry. The 1974 HUD Code, in effect, solidified a de facto monopoly for traditional stick builders while almost totally sidelining the ability of factory producers to compete. To see more about this distinction, as well as how economists changed their model for determining monopoly status in the 1950s, something that itself has been very destructive for competition and innovation in the U.S., you can read the whole article that I cite here, written by James Schmitz Jr. of the Minneapolis Fed. In the decades preceding the law, shipments of small manufactured homes, or modular homes, began taking more market share from the traditional stick builders, posing an existential threat to their home construction dominance. From 1960 to 1972, shipments of manufactured or modular homes jumped from around 100,000 units to almost 600,000 units per year. This represented a rise from 10% to almost 60% of the total number of new homes produced. And more importantly, these were predominantly small homes that were being bought by low-income Americans, allowing for rapid progress in the battle against erasing disparities in home ownership. But we can't have nice things. Prior to the law, the Department of Commerce projected that by 1980, shipments of manufactured homes would rise to nearly 900,000 units per year. However, successful intervention at the hands of trade organizations, unions, de facto construction monopolies, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development put the nail in the coffin of the factory-produced homes before that could happen. Instead of the projected $900,000 manufactured homes shipped in 1980, the law killed the industry, and only 200,000 manufactured homes were delivered. In the modern era, in 2017, shipments of manufactured homes had fallen below 100,000 units per year, or back to pre-1960s levels. Manufactured homes can be broken down into two categories, modular homes and panelized homes. Modular homes are delivered via truck as three-dimensional pieces and installed on site. Panelized homes, in contrast, are delivered as two-dimensional pieces that are assembled and installed on site after delivery. Generally, we will discuss modular homes. Modular homes, depending on the size and number of pieces, are either transported to the site on a chassis, the most cost-effective way, or for larger modular homes, the pieces may be transported on the back of a flatbed truck. For those transported on a chassis, prior to the 1974 law, the chassis would be removed at the site of installation, with most of the houses being installed on a permanent foundation. I actually grew up in a modular home that was built and installed in the 1970s, complete with a full basement, foundation, and attached garage. These houses are entirely indistinguishable from normal stick-built homes. I didn't even know that the house was a manufactured home until I was told about it many years later. The idea and concept that we have of a manufactured home has also played a role in the sabotage of the factory-produced home construction industry. When we think of a manufactured home, what comes to mind is a dilapidated and crumbling mobile home or trailer. Mounted on a permanent chassis and maybe some wheels, these homes today are largely constrained to the bad part of town, a trailer park somewhere on the outskirts, past the train tracks and on land that is zoned for industrial or manufacturing, rather than for residential purposes. Why is this the case? Well, because of that clever 1974 HUD law, of course. As with all successful anti-competitive initiatives, the 1974 HUD Code was multi-pronged. Here, we'll find the usual suspects: regulations, subsidies, financing restrictions, and derogatory information campaigns. Starting with the last, the American public was trained and conditioned to associate manufactured homes with trailers, rednecks, and low-class living. This associative conditioning continues on to this day. One aspect of the regulations imposed by the HUD Code was, strangely, that the manufactured home could not be removed from the chassis that was used to transport it on site. Or in other words, it required a permanent chassis to remain affixed to the home even after installation. Ostensibly, this was done for structural and safety purposes, but it would come to mark the primary feature that we associate with modern manufactured homes today, in phrases and terminology like, "Does your house got wheels?" "Trailers," "trailer park," and "trailer trash." Even if a manufactured home is to be installed on a foundation, it is still required by law that the chassis cannot be removed from the home and must be permanently affixed in case it needs to be moved. This requirement that the home stays mobile, or at least theoretically mobile, ties us into the other term that is used for these houses, mobile homes, a term that also has a negative connotation. Further, the requirement that the chassis stays affixed, regardless of if the house is to be installed on a permanent foundation or with a basement, increases the cost and complexity of the installation significantly. Doing so requires that the basement be dug deeper than normal and additional pier structures be used to support the home. Attempts to remove this requirement over the years have failed, perhaps hinting at the true significance and purpose. Maybe already we can begin wondering if the true intentions behind this requirement was more about sabotage than it was about consumer safety. You know, safety, that thing that is always used to launder horrible and destructive laws upon the populace. However, I remain unconvinced that the powers that be really do care at all about our well-being. But this requirement for a permanent chassis opens up another prong of attack, finance. Although manufactured homes are rarely ever moved, the presence of a chassis means that the house could be moved. In the absence of a rich daddy, most regular people require mortgage financing to purchase their home. Mortgages that come with many federal protections and reduced interest rates. Manufactured homes are, so conveniently, not eligible for traditional home mortgage financing. Instead, they must be financed with personal loans or chattel loans, those used for cars, tractors, and other movable assets. Ah, I see what you did there. Now, a person can get around this by paying the artificially inflated cost to permanently install the home with a foundation or basement, but this significantly increases installation and construction costs, as mentioned before. Further, this unsightly fixed chassis and the unusual installation techniques needed for accommodating the fixed chassis for a permanent foundation most likely depreciate the perceived value of the property in the eyes of secondary buyers, further disincentivizing people to purchase manufactured homes. A quick note about zoning and land use restrictions. The requirement for a chassis and the mobile home classification that comes with it is leveraged by local zoning regulations to exclude manufactured homes. Although zoning and land use restrictions are of course a big contributor to the U.S. housing crisis, we won't discuss them extensively in this video. Although the motivations for this NIMBYism is of course motivated by local homeowners themselves who wish to prop up the value of their homes and generally seek to limit new constructions, or at the very least, drive up costs. America, however, is a big country. Many smaller townships and rural areas often have non-existent or minimal building codes and zoning restrictions. Further, due to the size of America, it's always possible to create new communities, either on previously unused land or as part of a large developmental project, in areas that have zoning laws friendly to manufactured homes. However, the 1974 HUD Code, from the top-down federal level, disadvantages manufactured homes by requiring a building code that is much more strict than the building codes that predominate in small towns and rural areas, effectively sidelining the industry even further. In other words, stick builders can follow the minimal or even non-existent building codes when constructing homes in rural areas or small towns, whereas manufactured homes must always meet the much more stringent and more costly federal building codes that are required for all manufactured homes. Even prior to the 1974 HUD Code, the weapons of subsidies were already being used to attack the factory-produced home builders. In 1968, the Department of Housing and Urban Development introduced a series of subsidy programs exclusively for stick-built housing, while excluding access to these subsidies for factory-produced homes. If a builder was looking to purchase a stick-built home, they could get mortgage rates as low as 1%, while those looking to buy manufactured homes were not eligible. This effectively shifted demand from the rapidly growing manufactured home builders back to the traditional on-site builders. Despite this, as a testament to the popularity and affordability of manufactured homes, the number of shipments continued to rise up to a peak of almost 600,000 units per year in 1972. Prior to the sabotage, the reason for the rise in popularity of manufactured homes was simple: efficiency and cost. Factory production can leverage economies of scale, specialization, and efficiency, whereas on-site traditional stick builders simply cannot. If we look at labor productivity and durable goods manufacturing and home construction since 1987, we can see that factory production of durable goods has seen labor productivity increase by 250%. Whereas labor productivity for home construction, an industry that is dominated by traditional stick builders, only saw a 15% increase in labor productivity. And keep in mind, stick builders account for around 90% of new home construction. Continuing to subsidize these industries with government money only seeks to subsidize the inefficiencies that are inherent in these construction techniques. However, the multi-blow combo of the 1974 housing market collapse, the energy crisis, and the HUD Code that would go into effect in 1976 would ultimately put the nail in the coffin for the manufactured home builders, further assuring the continued domination of the monopolistic traditional home construction industry and helping to ensure the dismal future that we face in 2025 with respect to the housing crisis. There are other details regarding the regulatory disadvantages faced by manufactured homes, those having to do with the asymmetry between local building codes and the codes required for manufactured homes stipulated within the federal HUD law. But I will avoid a more lengthy discussion of those such that we can move on to the hard data. If you would like to know more, you can read the full article that I've cited from James A. Schmitz, Jr., principal research economist at the Minneapolis Fed, for more details. This was a great article, and this man is a real public servant fighting for the benefit of the American people. Next, we'll turn to the data. Does the data support this hypothesis that this 1974 HUD law is the root of our problems? Well, you can judge for yourself. First, we'll look at the number of new home construction starts from 1959 to 2024 and the 10-year moving average shown in orange. Yes, it would appear that new home construction has become more constrained since 1974. If we draw approximate trend lines on the 10-year moving average, we can see that prior to 1976, the rate of new home construction was increasing, whereas after the 1976 adoption of the HUD Code, new home constructions have fallen. Generally, it would seem that new home constructions have fallen by around 25% since the adoption of this law, falling from an approximate level of 1.6 million new homes per year down to only 1.2 million homes in the modern era. But as supply and demand dictates, an artificially constrained supply in the face of equal or growing demand means higher and higher prices. And of course, the U.S. population is always growing, and due to social changes, people now have much smaller household sizes, further boosting demand in the face of the constrained supply of new houses. As mentioned previously, small homes are the least profitable for traditional stick builders. Prior to the 1974 law, factory production dominated the market for small, affordable homes. If we examine the data for the average size or square footage of new American homes over time, we can see that the American houses have gotten progressively bigger, increasing by a factor of 2.4 from 1950 until the 2010s. Further, the average number of people living in a house has decreased by 23% over that period. This results in the average square footage per person jumping 3.2 times since 1950. If you are in the market for a small, affordable new house in 2025, it seems you may be largely out of luck. The data starts looking even worse when we examine new home construction per capita. Prior to the 1974 regulation, the U.S. was constructing around 8 new houses per 1,000 people. After the legislation, there's been a steady decline. In 2024, the new construction per capita metric has fallen from 8 houses per 1,000 in 1950 all the way down to 4 houses per 1,000 people in 2024, a decrease in 50%. Now that would certainly work to jack up housing prices. If we draw approximate trend lines over the 10-year moving average, we can see that the rate of home construction per capita prior to the mid-70s was stable, and after 1976, it began declining steeply. We can next check to see if supply and demand is true for housing. Unsurprisingly, yes it is. After 1974, we can see that the average home price in the U.S. has increased by a factor of 13. If we note the slope of the curve over time, we can see that the rate of increase in home prices shot up dramatically after the year 2000 in the lead up to the U.S. housing bubble. The bubble, of course, was caused by the inadvisable practices of giving people without sufficient money, jobs, assets, or credit histories huge mortgages with adjustable rates. Here, we have an example of the dividends that can be made by financial entrepreneurs from constraining the supply of houses in the first place. The government stepped in with an initiative to ostensibly support first-time homebuyers. They pushed risky policies in order to quote-unquote help people. Builders made a ton of money, banks made a lot of money, the scheme collapsed, the global economy almost imploded, and then the people responsible were bailed out by the taxpayers themselves. Fun times. We can also see another economic lesson in this data, one that is denied by those who believe in the voodoo of modern monetary theory. Excessive money printing causes inflation. If we look at the U.S. M2 money supply, we can see that around 40% of the total money supply was printed in the 2-year period following the COVID pandemic. What did this do to the price of housing? Well, over this period, predictably, home prices shot up by 33%, despite being limited somewhat by a sharp jump in mortgage interest rates. Good news for those who already owned assets. Bad news for those who saw the value of their savings decrease by approximately 40%. while suddenly having to muster an additional 33% if they wanted to make a responsible down payment on a first home. To normalize home sale data, we can calculate a ratio of the average home price over the median personal income from 1974 to 2024. We can see that in 1974, the average home price was around 7.3 times higher than the median personal income. By 2024, this had jumped to 12.8, increasing by a factor of 1.8. Relative to income, houses are now almost 2 times more expensive than before. Bad news once again, better look forward to buying your first home at 40 and hoping that you have stable income over the next 30 years to pay off your house by 70. If, it doesn't get foreclosed on sometime in that period due to some kind of unforeseen, unprecedented economic crisis. It seems everything nowadays is quote-unquote unprecedented. This is a fairly simple analysis, but it seems that the data following the 1974 HUD regulations are consistent with the hypothesis that this policy both artificially constrained the U.S. housing supply, helped to drive up housing prices, and sought to further worsen disparities in home ownership. We can also turn to the generational effects downstream of the 1974 HUD regulations. Here, we can find that one generation came out a winner, while the following generations can be lumped into the loser category. If we look at the years in which baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials were first buying their homes, we can get a feel for what the home price to income ratio was. For the baby boomers, their peak years for buying a first home were in the 1970s and 1980s. During this period, the ratio was in between 7 and 11. For Gen X, they began buying their first homes in the late 90s and early 2000s. The ratio for this period rose to a range of 9 to 12. For millennials, post-financial crisis and post-COVID money printing, the ratio has risen to the 10 to 13 range. For baby boomers, they dealt with high interest rates during their first-time home buying years, but otherwise, home prices were at a reasonable level relative to income levels. Gen X ran headfirst into the carefully laid financial bear trap of the housing bubble and the great financial crisis. The millennials, although helped by low interest rates during the post-crisis quantitative easing period, have dealt with increasingly more unaffordable housing, as well as the subsequent spike in mortgage interest rates following the COVID money printing bonanza. Generation Z, unless they are very financially astute, are Bitcoin millionaires, have rich parents, or are successful social media influencers, will have to deal with all of these challenges simultaneously as they begin moving into their prime home buying years. And perhaps, most disturbing of all, is that small affordable entry-level homes are almost non-existent in most markets. This will be further exacerbated by retiring baby boomers downsizing, selling their big McMansions at the top of the market, pocketing the cash, and using the scraps to put down above-ask cash bids on smaller homes, further driving up the unaffordability of the so-called starter home. What an interesting synergy. Although baby boomers faced their own challenges, if they were able to get on the property ladder, they benefited immensely from the decades-long process of constraining the housing supply and juicing the real estate prices. If we look at the share of real estate assets by generation, this becomes fairly obvious. Here, we have this data for the year 1995 and 2024. In the year 1995, the mid-range baby boomer was approximately the same age as a mid-range millennial in 2024, somewhere in their late 30s. In 1995, baby boomers already owned 42% of U.S. real estate assets, while the young up-and-coming Generation X only owned around 5%. By 2024, the share owned by the baby boomers has stayed constant at 41%. For Gen X, their share rose to 29%, and millennials now own 20% of the real estate assets. Of course, generation size plays a role in this metric. Conveniently, baby boomers and millennials are currently roughly equal to one another in population, coming in at around 72 to 74 million people. Gen X, in contrast, is a smaller generation by about 10%. Assuming that a baby boomer in 1995 was approximately the same age as a millennial in 2024, from this data, we can see that the share of real estate assets held by the millennials is around 50% less than the share that the baby boomers had managed to acquire by 1995. For Gen X, if we roughly normalize for their population being around 10% smaller, they, in 2024, despite being even older than baby boomers were in 1995, had managed to acquire around 25% less real estate assets. So, we can potentially chalk up another socially destabilizing outcome that seems to have resulted from the 1974 HUD law, an increase in the level of economic disparity between the generations. This is especially relevant nowadays in the high inflation world that has resulted from the COVID-era money printing. Those without hard assets are most harmed by money printing and inflation. The owners of hard assets, much less so. In the U.S., a person's home represents around 25 to 40% of their net worth, with this number being closer to 40% for lower income groups. For baby boomers, they were largely able to acquire their first home and get onto the property ladder before the subsequent explosion in real estate prices. They were able to ride this wave, with some buying and selling houses repeatedly along the way, leveling up their net worth as they went. If we look at the per capita net worth by generation, we can see that the per capita net worth for baby boomers is just shy of $1.2 million. For Gen X, it is $640,000, and for the younger millennial generation, it is slightly over $200,000. And of course, real estate and home values underpin a large portion of this net wealth. Take away a person's ability to get onto the property ladder and acquire hard assets, and you'll sap their ability to accrue wealth at all. Further, rental prices have also skyrocketed in recent years. Along with post-COVID inflation, this howls out a person's disposable income and makes it even harder to save for a home. But perhaps, when home prices may be in the $500,000 to $1 million range, buying a home no longer looks like a realistic possibility, nonetheless a good value proposition. But returning to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, shelter is a necessity. Although the game of constraining home supplies and inflating property values has been a fun game for some, not addressing it risks destabilizing society even further. And of course, the housing crisis is only one of the intentionally foolish, short-sighted, and greed-fueled policies that have prevailed over the last 30 years or so. Deindustrialization stole people's jobs. Outsourcing transferred our wealth to communist China. The opioid crisis addicted and ended the lives of almost 1 million Americans. $8 trillion was incinerated on failed foreign wars, and we've racked up $36 trillion in debt. A less than ideal legacy for the richest generation in human history. At some point, the game needs to stop. But perhaps it's a message to the younger generations that they should think about consequences, the future, and the generations that will, hopefully, come after them. When you hear a politician propose a policy, think about it. Will it financially benefit you in the short term so that you can keep buying more and more material possessions? Or, in the long term, will it destroy your country? A good thought experiment to conduct every time you hear some kind of proposal from the mouth of a politician or from the mouth of a paid expert on corporate media. But, of course, we cannot blame baby boomers. They were raised and indoctrinated in an era that came before the open internet, free access to information, and open discourse. On top of whatever social engineering experiments were conducted on them in the 1960s and 70s. When you were raised by the talking heads and experts on TV, your mentality and behavior will be molded by the agenda of those who pay for those talking heads and experts. Regardless of the polarization, discourse was kept within a narrow crack of the Overton window. Not all of them were deceived, of course. Many of them saw these problems decades ago, but they had no means to transmit their observations beyond their small circle. But as long as we still have a mostly free internet, we can still freely exchange ideas and possible solutions. In 2025, the Hall of Mirrors has been shattered, and perhaps we can attempt to find more real and sustainable solutions. More people understand that the two faces of our political system were merely two faces of a single coin. A coin that is bought and paid for in the pursuit of draining the vast amounts of American middle-class wealth. So far, this pursuit has been done with hyper-competence. And all across the West, we can find similar variations of the same painting. We can either try to find practical, innovative solutions, or, in the case of factory-produced manufactured homes, rediscover them, or we can give in to the plan, own nothing, buy everything from China, close up all our factories, and make ourselves dumber by not thinking, reading, and writing, and keep listening to the experts that have led us down this path. For now, it may still be a primrose path, one marked by indulgences and pleasures, but staying on this path will surely lead us to ruin. We can also see how the consequences of the 1974 HUD Code propagate and exacerbate other crises within the U.S. society. As evidenced by the poor improvement in labor productivity within the traditional construction industry, protecting this industrial sector via federal regulations and subsidies not only contributes to artificially inflated home prices and a restricted supply of housing, but it also exacerbates the labor shortage within the construction industry itself. The inefficiencies within the traditional construction industry not only drive up costs, but they require more workers. This ties directly into the U.S. illegal immigration crisis. The traditional construction industry reports a labor shortage for construction workers. This narrative is very useful as it provides an explanation for high construction costs. Further, this very real problem of insufficient construction workers is used to justify illegal immigration, a system where impoverished people must pay thousands of dollars to dangerous cartels, coyotes, and criminal syndicates for the privilege of being smuggled into America illegally. Once here, undocumented migrants are at the mercy of those who they may be indebted to, and they work within the U.S. construction industry for reduced wages and with inadequate worker protections. This undercuts the earning potential of American workers as well as immigrants who have gone through the correct immigration channels and work in the U.S. legally. It is estimated that undocumented workers make $3.12 less per hour than American-born construction workers. It is estimated further that in New York City, 40% of construction workers are undocumented, while in Texas, it is roughly 50%. Many of these undocumented construction workers may not be building residential homes, but a significant portion of them are. In other words, the inefficiencies within the traditional construction industry doesn't even contribute to a lot of good job creation for U.S. citizens or legal immigrants, but it does fuel the system of illegal immigration. In addition to creating downward pressure on wages for legal American workers, the system also results in extensive tax avoidance and an erosion of federal, state, and payroll tax revenues. Although many undocumented immigrants do pay taxes, many also do not. Measuring the true extent of the tax avoidance that results from non-documented workers is nearly impossible. Further, the nature of the traditional construction industry enables tax avoidance, as these industries typically include a large network of various subcontractors who may pay their workers in cash or illegally classify them as 1099 independent contractors instead of W-2 employees. If the 1974 HUD Code can be reformed and factory-produced manufactured homes can be prioritized by our government, it could go a long way to solving the artificially created U.S. housing crisis and make home construction much, much more efficient. If we switch to factory-produced homes, there will still be undocumented migrants that work in these factories, but structurally, it's a lot easier to monitor this activity within the confines of a factory rather than amongst the complex web of contractors and subcontractors. Further, this would go a long way for protecting the wages of American-born workers, law-abiding legal immigrants, and to potentially increase tax revenue collection. The move towards factory-produced houses will also not entirely gut the traditional construction industry. Those industries can still build commercial buildings, assist with infrastructure improvements, another enormous problem that America is facing, and also provide the on-site services associated with the installation of factory-produced homes. Ultimately, it could be a rare win-win situation for us all. Anyway, if you made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel, or leave me a comment. Thanks again, and have a nice day or night.